Hey there, hope you're doing well. This is podcast number 3 in this API Gateway series. In the last one, the first one I gave you context and some idea about the core problem we're trying to solve. In the last one, we talked a bit more, got into the details about README documentation, about Postman workspaces and Insomnia, and then we got as far as the actual API gateway that we're building, that we're hosting on AWS and using Lambda and all the serverless computing, right? So let's get into a bit more detail there. So right now, if you recall the last one, or if I highly recommend you watch it before you get to this one, I talked about the notion of pre and post processes at the endpoint level and at the overall request and response level, right? So that is one of the value add that the gateway brings to the table. There's plenty of other requirements for the gateway, right? Beyond the typical requirements you would expect for a gateway to do, or to have or to satisfy, there are very business specific requirements that this particular gateway or any gateway is going to address, essentially, right? So one is, okay, how do I we already talked about the processing, pre, post and whatnot, right? Those are hooks, if you will, in other words. Now on top of that, let's say the client makes a request and let's say they're calling slash keys to fetch a list of keys from our system. Now, a different client might actually want to call slash projects, right? And again, I'm kind of jumping the gun here because in our first release, this is not something we support, but we may or may not take the effort to sort of publicize that, because we have enough other fish to fry. But this is all actual value add that's part of the core API gateway that we are building. Let's say there's a different client who might want to use it slightly, who might actually benefit, I don't know if benefit is the right word, maybe they like a slightly different language, right? And again, the API is going to be consumed by companies across the globe. So again, there's regional and differences in just the English language. A lot of the API I've seen, API documentation, they don't seem to give you that option. And while you could argue it's a nice to have, I think it's a little bit more than a nice to have, because sometimes if it speaks your language, it's much easier as a developer, as a product owner, to consume and understand what it's doing, right? When I see slash something, whether it's slash employees or slash projects or slash keys or slash restaurants or slash planes, I think that if I'm a plane company, I'd rather it say planes than like trains, right? It doesn't matter. I can probably draw the parallel or connect the dots, but I think it makes it easier. So one of the features that we have supported in our gateway is the notion of aliases, right? Which means it's very internal, right? It's not so much public to the end user. Eventually we would publish an endpoint in multiple forms. Maybe we call it slash keys for the community that understands our existing language and verbiage, and they see eye to eye in terms of our terminologies, right? Our glossary, it's Snowball's glossary, so to speak. But what if you like the word projects better because it's a much simpler English word and it's not domain or company specific, right? So you might want to call it projects, or you as a product owner would understand and get the gist of it, but you feel like your developers, and given the context of what your team is doing, you prefer that it be called something else. Now we've built that functionality into our gateway, so you could basically we would expose that using a few different aliases, right? So let's say I would say slash keys or slash projects or boards or views or whatever it is, essentially. So when you're consuming it speaks a bit more of your language. It speaks to you, right? So that's one feature. We have a very specific need for which we actually implemented this, but this is sort of the side effect benefit, if you will, right? It's more than a side effect benefit, but hopefully you get the essence of what I'm trying to say here. That's one feature that the gateway supports. Next, in terms of, let's say when the gateway gets the request, it needs to determine where to forward those requests to, right? So now let's say there is going to be a number of microservices behind the gateway, right? That is not privy to the end user in this case being a developer, a dev team, other systems, apps, whatnot, right? It's not privy to them, but we know that if this request comes in, it's asking for a cup of tea, I may need to route it to a microservice, right? Let's say we started a food microservice because maybe it's small enough that it was part of food, and maybe there's another travel microservice, right? Let's say we only have 2 microservices, but let's say tomorrow we grow enough, the API grows enough from a food standpoint that we have enough beverage consumers or companies interested in integrating with it, right? So maybe we then decide, you know what, maybe tea needs to be its own microservice, right? Maybe coffee it's its own microservice, and I don't want to try wine because other than wine is like a generic commodity to me. Unfortunately, I cannot tell the differences between them. But I'm sure if you get into the world of wines, there could be different microservices for different types of, I don't even want to try it, but different types of grapes or which part of the world it's coming from, right? Anyway, so, but you get the idea. So there's a tea microservice and a coffee microservice and maybe some other food microservice, right? Now, if the gateway gets the request for get me the list of green teas versus give me the list of restaurants or food related items that's not tea or related to tea, what if we want to reroute it? Again, I'm kind of completely manufacturing these examples, but I'm only hoping it sends the message across, because our requirements are very, very specific to business problems, and I could express them here, but there's two challenges there. One is it's giving away a bit more before the movie is out, so we are like 15%, we have some distance to cover, and two, it might be a little bit too specific, maybe, right, to our problems, that maybe it resonates with you, maybe it doesn't, depending on your industry. So I'm trying to come up with these generic things that sound a bit more fun and less serious. That is the essence of me taking these random examples. So the API gateway is going to get the request. It's going to make a determination based on how it makes a determination is a topic for another video. But let's say there's some rules that define. It could be regex, as simple as that, or it could be more complicated rules that define how this routing needs to happen. So that intelligence is going to be embedded into the gateway, right? Whether it's the same Lambda, likely not, right? It's going to be multiple Lambdas that make up this ecosystem of the API AWS gateway. But regardless, it's going to go to the gateway, and you can think of a gateway as, let's think of it as a big circle with a number of AWS services. Now, we don't believe in vendor lock-in, so it's not all of them being in AWS, certainly not. But you got to drink the Kool-Aid to some extent. If you're publishing it in a certain platform, you don't want to fight the tide, right? If you're paying, it's like paying $250,000 for like a Oracle database or something. Isn't that expensive? Then you want to use, all of the analytical and other functions that Oracle provides you, as opposed to arguing that I'll stick to ANSI SQL even after paying like $250,000 for Oracle, right? If you're paying the kind of money, use what they give you. Otherwise, just go with MySQL or Postgres, which probably anyways you should actually go with one of those two. Anyways, that's besides the point. So the gateway is going to have some intelligence built into the routing and make some decisions based on that. Then going to say, hey, you know what, let me send this to the tea service versus the coffee service versus the food service, for instance, right? That's one more. I think I already mentioned 4 or 5 features that make up the API, the gateway, but I'll keep going as long as I can remember from the most recent things we've done this week. The other is the massaging of the response back, right? Now you make a request to get a list of projects. The language that we speak internally at Snowpile is going to be different from the language we want to expose to our end users. So there's a certain there's an element of massaging that's required, and that will be done by the API gateway. Now, a lot of that massaging is going to be API agnostic, like endpoint agnostic, and API agnostic, but there are certainly going to be there's going to be some logic that might end up being API specific, even if not endpoint specific, right? So the tricky part here is to determine where the line is. Where do you draw the line? You don't want to make changes on the core API. You do not want to make changes on the core API server if those changes are not generic to a lot of your consumers, right? And then what happens to existing systems, like our own products and apps that consume those endpoints? We don't want to have to redo any of what we've already done, which works just fine, to satisfy the differences or the nuances that this new architecture is going to bring to the table, right? So backwards compatibility at the top of our requirements list from a core API standpoint. So the massaging, a good fair amount of the response massaging is going to happen on the AWS API gateway. So that's is it like 5 or 6? I lost count in terms of the features that it brings to the table. And I'm close to the 10-minute mark, so I have to end here to be able to publish the video on a lot of the other platforms without me having to do the editing. That's basically it. In this video, we'll pick up from video number 4 in this series in the next podcast. Don't forget to sign up on snowpile.com and solve problems better, right? That's what we're here for. Users solve problems better. Thank you.